Thank you so much for joining us for another edition of All Angles. I'm Dion Jackson Miller. No, we're not in studio today. That's because given the controversies of the past few weeks and indeed months about the Maroon communities and the government of Jamaica, how they relate to each other, given controversial statements made by Accompong Chief Richard Curry, as well as Prime Minister Andrew Holness, we've come to Accompong to talk to Chief Curry about issues in the public domain. Do the Maroons see themselves as Jamaicans?
The Maroons see themselves as the first peoples of the land, the indigenous people of the land. And we have been here forever, as far back as the records shows us. And we know when we talk about sovereignty, there are many definitions in using the word sovereignty. When we talk about sovereignty, we're talking about the freedom.
Just before you go on to, I just want to be clear.
Yes.
Because your response was that we see ourselves as indigenous people, the first people.
Right.
But in 2022,
Yes.
do you describe yourself as Jamaican? Do you see yourself as a part of the country of Jamaica, as citizens of Jamaica?
All right. Let's put it this way. Again, if we're going to look at the dynamics of how history and time has progressed, right, we have understood the existence of a prior entity, a nation, that signed a treaty with the British, right? It's been said by the High Commissioner himself, who came here to reaffirm the status of that treaty, the standing of that treaty that was signed between two sovereign nations. These were his words, exactly. That's the previous British High Commissioner, Asif. And when we look at the definition in the freedom of the soil, we were always free people. We lived off our land. We essentially blossom from our land. And the saying, the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, right? We are nothing but a manifestation of this earth that we live on. We've always lived here. Our ancestors fought to defend it. And in years that have transcended since then, we have identified ourselves as these people, knowing the rights that we have, owning the land that we're on. So when we talk about sovereignty in its definition, it's the freedom, it's that which is derived from the freedom of this land.
And I want to explore that a little bit more, except that you're not answering me at all, Chief. But it's an easy question. Are you guys Jamaicans or not? Do you see yourselves as Jamaicans?
We are.
Okay. So let's
all
talk
the
then
same.
about sovereignty, because there have been a number of legal experts who have been analyzing the meaning of the word in terms of strict international law terms. Is this the phrase, for instance, that we've heard long before you, with the Maroons saying they belong to a state within a state? They're sovereign people. You know, those are words and phrases that are coming from decades.
Of course.
But what does it really mean? So we've had scholars such as constitutional expert Dr. Lloyd Barnett, Queen's Counsel former Solicitor General Michael Hilton, Professor of International Law at UA Stephen Bassiani, saying, as far as international law is concerned, no, the Maroons are part of Jamaica. The community is part of Jamaica. It's not a separate state in the sense of being a separate country. So let me ask you to respond to that.
All right. So when it gets to the legalese, we always try to avoid using certain terms which often confuses people, and that's why I like when I talk, I have the backative from the legal standing, and Dominic, which I introduced earlier, has also presented the different ideologies, looking and showing how this thing really operates. So we have known a formula, meaning how we operate as a autonomous people, and in terms of the confines of our space, these are things now which gets into a higher level conversation, because sovereignty also speaks a definition of a boundary, and for long ages we have always come to know specific territories and areas that are always and have always been Maroon lands, our sacred lands, right? As to a boundary and a definition of a boundary, those are challenges that today we still have to try and work out, because the language that has been presented isn't as clear cut as one would think. So the treaty we've had several interpretations of what is the Maroon land. Is it 1,500 acres? Because it says 1,500 acres bearing northwest of Trelawney Town. So let me ask them, how big was Trelawney Town? Trelawney Town was the original settlement. How big was Accompong, which was a part of Trelawney Town? There are other conversations which haven't been brought forward in looking at this 1,500 acre allotment, which leads us to believe that this 1,500 acres is an increment to what was already understood to be in control and possession of the Maroons.
Chief Corey would have explained that at that time when the treaty was written, even though in today's modern interpretation some clauses may be repugnant, but at that time it was speaking of a time of war and slavery. Regardless of that fact, it also spoke about the freedom and liberties that shall last forever for the Maroon people. And then it also talked about, in perpetuity for the born and unborn. Within laws, let's say even titleship, land patents, where it would say for your heirs and assigns forever. Someone has to look at this language and interpret it, because they would now be looking at who actually owns the fee simple absolute estate, to know that if they're the actual true landlord of the land. Now, in this retrospect for the Maroons in that treaty, we would have to understand who is actually the landlord of these lands after the war, who controls these lands after the war. That's where sovereignty is being derived from. Because when the Crown sends their plenipotentiaries to Accompong to wave the white flag in order to say that they're coming to peace with the Maroon government, so that peace may reign over the island again and commerce can continue. Because this was for 83 to 84 years that commerce was being disrupted. So we have to actually look, at history and law. They're not mutually exclusive, right? So that in today's modern society, we cannot forget the sovereignty, even though it may provoke people as we speak about it, because from the Roman Empire to many empires, the Ottoman Empire and such, sovereignty has been described in many different ways, of course, because governments rise and fall.
Which is why I'm asking you, in 2022,
Correct.
just explain for me in simple terms what it means for you.
What it means for us is to be able to actually stand on our birthright in a essence where our situation as today, or what should have happened in 1962, as Chief Corey would have mentioned in that letter, that we can invoke that power to say that we need to come to the table if there is another government or another entity, whether de facto, quasi, etc., would have to now say, okay, what is this other entity, government, saying? Do they have the right? Do they have the authority? Do they have the sovereignty of the soil? These soils are not taxed. If they're not taxed and they have no titleship under the government of Jamaica, then how can it be the government of Jamaica's lands? This can easily be cleared up if they make a phone call to the Crown, and if anybody has factual information or paperwork that they can bring to say otherwise, that should be brought forward so that this argument would be cleared up, where maybe you guys wouldn't be interviewing us, because then you would be saying that would be a waste of time.
I know you're speaking there about the concept of the Maroon land.
Yeah.
Which itself is something that, scholars have written on. Scholars have studied. David Batts, for instance, wrote a whole article on Maroon lands and where it falls.
Right.
But the average Jamaican, I don't think, is thinking in those terms. They're thinking in terms of whether or not y'all plan to take up guns and go fight JDF and take over Garden House and take over Jamaica House.
Right. But you see, that would then be the responsibility of the media to come and
Oh, it's
help.
our fault?
No, 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 I didn't say that. No, I didn't say that. Well, I am saying that I'm going to be honest, what we have noticed.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm going to let you answer
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
but
yeah.
just respond specifically for me to what I said.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because
Can
really
you
and
repeat it
truly, there
again?
are
Sorry.
people who think so and want to take over.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
That is clearly, that would be a very stupid decision from any responsible way to
Do you
say
want
that
to put up barbed wire all around your borders and say nobody else can come in? This is a separate country.
this is a separate. No, I don't think that is what is going to happen. What should happen and must happen at this period in time, at this juncture, based on all the evidence and at this point, the preponderance of evidence that can be brought forward in any court of law, but in the proper venue, that is what matters.
You use some of the words, for instance, that are causing the difficulty. Sovereignty is one, autonomy is another, another is self-determination.
Right.
And there are scholars who have said that, I interviewed some 2 weeks ago, who have said that when the Maroons speak of sovereignty, what they're speaking about is autonomy. What they're speaking about is the ability to determine their own fate and to run their own communities. But when we hear the leaders speak, it seems to contradict that.
Correct.
So let me ask you now, is it that you want to secede from Jamaica?
No, that is not. So this is it. That's why I say that there are levels in how you view sovereignty, right? There's the respect for the land and the territory, right? And as Maroons, we've always prided ourselves in maintaining, preserving, and living from our land, right? So when we talk about sovereignty, we talk about protecting those sacred lands, right? There are many areas in the cockpits that we lived, people still live. Our ancestors are actually buried in these lands, right? So for us, the argument of sovereignty is recognition of the space that we occupy, but also the identity that comes with it. This is not something that is new, right? When you look at what happens with the tribal Indians in the United States and the relationship with the government, you see that there are models which actually recognizes the separateness of these people, but there are facilities and measures in place to allow the integration and mutually beneficial relationships of these two entities. So it's not something that is new or novel. It already exists. So what we're saying is knowing what our entitlements are, which is not just on the premise of indigenous rights, but as First Peoples who actually live here, are buried here, and control the space for as long as history can tell us.